is what emotions are involved in morality and why. I think the what emotions part of the question was summed up really nicely by Linda Levine and David Pizarro, who said that people might feel elated or terrifying or despairing or furious, but they don't just feel aroused. You don't say, oh, I feel emotional today. So that person in the trolley problem, standing by the switch or on the footbridge, is feeling something specific, not just emotionally aroused. What is it that they're feeling? This question is an important one because specific emotions have characteristic effects on our thinking and on our behavior. So to take just one example, fearful people tend to have a pessimistic view of the future, whereas angry people tend to be optimistic. So what this suggests is that in the moral domain, the choices that people make are likely to be influenced by what specific emotions that they're feeling. And these patterns of emotional effects also start to get at the why part of the question. Why do people feel certain emotions in certain situations? The answer is that these patterns of behavior are thought to be adaptive. So not necessarily in every case, but over an evolutionary timescale, these emotions represented adaptive problems to certain kinds of recurring situations. So, what emotions are important in morality and why? An especially interesting emotion that seems to have gotten all wrapped up in morality is disgust. And once you start looking for it, you actually see that the language of disgust is just everywhere in moral dialogue. So here's an example from last year. This is the Salon.com columnist Glenn Greenwald, who's commenting on the indefinite detention bill. That's the bill that allows American citizens to be detained indefinitely without trial. What Glenn Greenwald says is that the language of the bill President Obama will sign is crystal clear on most issues, and it's repugnant. It's not terrifying, it's not infuriating, it's repugnant. Here's a more recent example. This is the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England commenting on the Libor scandal. He says, "I can't be confident about anything after learning of this cesspit." In case you're not familiar with the language of international finance, this is not usually the kind of language that the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England says. So that's pretty interesting. It's especially interesting when you stop and consider what disgust is and where it came from. So disgust is thought to have started off its evolutionary life as an emotion that's involved in food selection. In particular, it's started to have originated in distaste, which is a reaction to basically ingesting something that tastes bad. And the behavioral tendency that goes with distaste is called oral rejection. It's basically a spit it out response. Get this bad tasting thing out of my mouth. And this is a very adaptive response because although not all bad tasting things are poisonous, most poisonous things are bad tasting. So here's an example. These are yew berries. I actually grew up with a yew berry hedge next to me. My mom always said, do not eat the yew berries. And that's because in spite of these lovely, juicy looking red berries, the seeds are very toxic. Fortunately, they're also very bitter. So although I never did eat one of the yew berries, if I had, hopefully I would have spat it out before the toxins had any effect on me. So we see the distaste response in human infants almost as soon as they're born and throughout all of the other animals as well. And in fact, this ability to detect and reject toxins seems to go back very far indeed. So sea anemones, which evolved around 500 million years ago for the first time, if you feed them something bitter, you're cruel and you spike their food with quinine, for example, it will actually spit it out of its gastric cavity. So while distaste has a pretty circumscribed role in defending the body against toxins, disgust is thought to have co-opted this oral rejection response to defend the body against a much wider range of threats. In particular, disgust seems to be involved in defending the body against infectious disease and other threats to biological fitness. So I did my PhD in Toronto, and in Toronto, the city does public health inspections on all the buildings, or all the businesses rather, that sell food. And this is a closed notice for a grocery store that was shut down because of a giant rat infestation. It's also it's not just any grocery store. This is the grocery store where I did my shopping as a graduate student. So I think this illustrates two interesting things about disgust. First of all, distaste is very closely tied to the sense of taste. So you eat something that tastes bad, you spit it out. By contrast, I don't have to eat anything from this grocery store in order to experience disgust. And judging by some of your expressions, you might even have experienced a little vicarious disgust on my behalf. So disgust is much less closely tied to gustatory, to taste sensation, than is distaste. Secondly, disgusting things are contaminating in a way that merely distasteful things are not. So imagine that I don't like Brussels sprouts. They're kind of bitter, I tend to avoid them. I can still buy other things in a grocery store that sells Brussels sprouts. In the case of this particular grocery store, it turned out that the rat infestation was mostly confined to the bakery. So I should be fine to buy other things in that grocery store, right? No, not so much. I don't want to eat anything that comes from that grocery store. So disgust is much more contaminating than distaste. So rats and food contamination are one example of a disgusting stimulus. But disgust is also evoked by other threats to health, including body products like feces and vomit, sexual practices that might be maladaptive. I had this listed as, this is incest apparently, not inbreeding avoidance, for my conversation with Dan this morning. Good to know, because it's on my slides. And also close interpersonal contact with strangers who might have diseases that you're not immune to. So when you look at this whole trajectory, a pattern that emerges is an expansion of disgust from being responsive to very concrete threats through to ones that are progressively more removed from that origin in the distaste response. And this sets the stage for the final expansion of disgust into the moral domain. So I gave some anecdotal examples earlier of moral disgust, but there's also empirical evidence to show that people report that moral transgressions are disgusting. If they'll ask you, they say, yes, I'm disgusted by moral transgressions. If disgust has indeed expanded out of the physical world and into the moral domain, that has some interesting implications. So, first of all, disgust, like other emotions, comes with its own package of behavioral, motivational, and cognitive effects. So if we can understand when people are going to feel morally disgusted, we'll be much better able to understand what they're likely to do in those kinds of situations and why. Secondly, it also suggests that morality is bootstrapping off of some very ancient motivational processes. In other words, even though our morality is quite distinctively human, it's co-opting some processes that seem to have evolved a very long time ago for a very different purpose. So I find this story about the expansion of disgust to be very intuitive and quite compelling. I'm not the only one either. It's quite widely cited. But not everyone agrees. And in particular, this oral to moral trajectory of disgust is quite controversial. And I'm going to go through three specific critiques with you. One argument is that when we call a moral transgression disgusting, we're just speaking metaphorically. So we're using this language of contamination and decay to condemn someone without actually feeling anything that resembles our response to contamination or toxins. A related concern is that moral disgust might just be anger or some other emotion in disguise. So when we call moral transgressions disgusting, we're just mislabeling what we're feeling. Finally, even if you do think that disgust has a role to play in morality, some people have argued that disgust, and emotion in general, is just not that important in morality. So remember, I said that morality is about those judgments of right and wrong, which are different from just good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant. And some people have argued that emotions are just consequences of those judgments, that we arrive at via some other non-emotional route. So, well, now maybe you're not sure. Maybe the story I told you isn't such a good one after all. In the remainder of my talk, I'm going to go through each of these critiques and present some work that I've done to try and test them empirically. And by the end, I hope to convince you that these concerns actually don't hold water, and that disgust really is part of our moral emotional experience. start with that first concern, that moral disgust is just a metaphor. So to understand this concern, let's think about another expression that we sometimes use, maybe especially in academic circles, thirsting for knowledge. Arguably, we don't literally thirst for knowledge. So in the same way, maybe Glenn Greenwald isn't literally repulsed by the indefinite detention bill. One way that we could try and get at this concern is by asking whether moral transgressions actually activate the same neural circuitry that's associated with physical disgust. The brain is a big area, and it's probably best to look where the light is brightest. Where in the brain should we be looking for physical disgust? A good place to start looking is the insula. This is the insula here with the labels on it. You can see it's quite a large brain region, and in case it's been a while since your neuroanatomy class, it's tucked away underneath the frontal and temporal lobes. So students who are taking a cognitive neuroscience class often don't hear a lot about the insula, and that's in part because it's not involved in a lot of the processes that cognitive neuroscientists typically study, like memory or language or vision. Instead, what the insula seems to be very closely involved with is in processing signals that come from the body. It's also interesting that the insula is where primary gustatory cortex is located. So this is where the very first cortical representation of the sense of taste is. That's very interesting. This region is often implicated in disgust, so that's interesting given that disgust is thought to have originated in this gustatory response to unpleasant tastes. So, to test whether the insula is involved in both moral transgressions and physical disgust, we did an fMRI study. We first conducted what's called a functional localizer to try and confirm that the insula really is involved in physical disgust. So while undergoing fMRI, we had our subjects look at a variety of different photographs. And to try and isolate the activity that was associated with disgust, they also looked at a series of neutral photographs. And we looked for areas of the brain that are more active in response to the disgusting photographs than to the neutral photographs. As predicted, we saw strong activation of the bilateral anterior insula. Now the question is, are we going to see the same kinds of activations in response to moral transgressions? To test this question, we had our subjects read a series of written scenarios. The scenarios are all set in a high school, and some of them describe moral transgressions, like writing racist graffiti on someone's locker. And the subject's task was to just tell us how wrong this action was on a scale from 1 to 9. Subjects also read neutral scenarios, and to isolate the activity that was specific to this moral processing, we looked for regions that were more active in response to moral transgressions than neutral scenarios. So what turns up, once again, is the anterior insula. But the images I've just shown you, we would have to kind of eyeball them to confirm that, in fact, those are the same areas of the insula that are involved. To test this question, we looked for regions that were both more active in response to disgusting photographs than neutral photographs, also more active in response to moral transgressions than neutral scenarios. That's called a conjunction analysis in fMRI language. And what comes out is the anterior insula. So when the deputy governor of the Bank of England says that the banking industry is like a cesspit, he may actually be activating some of the same brain regions that would be involved in looking at a cesspit. I want to point out, too, it's interesting that these are the very anterior regions of the insula. We know from other research that the anterior insula is especially where gustatory sensation is localized. So it's interesting that, let me back up. This suggests that moral disgust might be actually tapping into these most primitive forms of disgust associated with bad tastes and toxicity. So the evidence I've just presented definitely implies that moral disgust is probably not a metaphor. Instead, moral transgressions seem to literally activate the same brain regions as do physically disgusting stimuli. Now, I've argued that moral disgust isn't just a metaphor, but I think it could well be a metaphor in a much more interesting way. In particular, it could be an embodied metaphor. And I believe you had, last year you had Simone Schnall to speak to you, so some of you might have heard a little bit about embodied theories of cognition. But in short, what they suggest is that abstract concepts like moral disgust or interpersonal warmth are grounded in concrete perceptual and motor systems. So in this sense, we may understand interpersonal repugnance by actually activating experiences of physical repugnance. Now, so far the arguments I've made have all been based on overlap in the neural substrates for physical disgust and moral transgressions. But some of you might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable around now, especially if you've done some neuroimaging work with that kind of difference. So you might be worried about what the overlapping neural activation actually means. To help me explain this concern, here's Ryan Gosling. Hey girl, you light up my insula. That must mean I love you. Now, you don't have to know anything about Ryan Gosling or memes or love to know that something seems a little fishy with Ryan's logic here. And the issue is something that I call the specificity problem. The problem is that insula activation is not specific to disgust. Although disgust happens to be an especially strong activator of the insula, it's not the only thing that activates the insula. So it's fairly risky to infer that if we see shared insula activation, that necessarily represents a shared experience of disgust. A more cautious interpretation is that there are at least common psychological processes between disgust and morality. Of course, specificity problems are not unique to neuroimaging. And that leads me to the next concern about moral disgust, which is that moral disgust is really just anger in disguise or some other feeling. So this concern arose primarily from specificity problems in verbal self-reports of disgust. And by that, I just mean people telling you how they feel. The problem is that when you ask subjects to describe a time, tell me about a time you felt angry, tell me about a time you felt disgusted, they actually describe very similar situations, sometimes even indistinguishable. So if someone tells you that they feel disgusted, it's hard to actually tell if they were feeling anger or disgust. Well, I already suggested earlier that fMRI can't deal with this problem, and self-report is tricky too. So what should we do? What we would really like is a measure that is more specific to disgust. One potential solution is to use emotional facial expressions. And in particular, anger and disgust seem to have relatively distinct facial expressions. So let's do a little poorly controlled seminar experiment. I'm going to show you two facial expressions, and we're going to check and see. You're going to tell me who you think is the one who smells something bad. So hands up if you think it's the man who smells something bad. No? Hands up if you think it's the woman. Okay, there's my science paper for you. So according to quite a lot of research, indeed it's the woman who's showing the facial expression of disgust. And what's characteristically different about the disgust expression is this action of wrinkling the nose and raising the upper lip. That's something that seems to be fairly specific to disgust, and indeed you're not seeing any of those kinds of actions in the anger facial expression. So, in contrast to other measures of disgust, the disgust facial expression might actually be specific to disgust, and it can distinguish disgust from other emotional experiences, and especially from anger. So, using this approach of looking at facial expressions, I'm going to go through a series of experiments with you. Our overall aim is going to be to ask whether there is continuity of facial expressions of disgust from physical forms of disgust to moral forms of disgust. If people are making the same facial expressions, then that provides converging evidence that moral transgressions really are evoking disgust. Along the way, we're going to be wanting to double check that our measures are actually specific to disgust. We want to make sure we're actually measuring disgust and not some other thing. So I'm going to be presenting 3 experiments. One where we looked at oral distaste, a second study where we looked at physical disgust, and finally one where we looked for moral disgust. All three of these experiments used facial electromyography to measure the disgust expression. That's a technique where we just attach small electrodes to the surface of the face, and they measure changes in electrical potential that are associated with contraction of the facial muscles. So as I mentioned, the key feature of the disgust expression is this action of raising the upper lip and wrinkling the nose. These actions are produced by the levator labii muscle of the face, and that's where we targeted our EMG recordings. Study 1 looked at the facial response to that most basic form of disgust, oral distaste. So remember, that's that very old oral rejection response that you get to tasting something bad. Now, my IRB wouldn't let me feed people poisons, but I was allowed to give them small liquid samples, including unpleasant liquids to tap distaste, pleasant liquids, and neutral liquids for comparison. And those pleasant liquids are an especially important specificity control here, because we match the unpleasant and pleasant liquids for intensity. So how strong tasting are these liquids? That way we can be sure that any levator labii activity that we see in one category but not the other is actually because of the difference in pleasantness. Here are the results. So this is levator labii activity of the EMG, or of the EMG activity at the levator labii for the neutral, sweet, and unpleasant tastes. And you can see pretty clearly that it's just the unpleasant tastes that are activating the levator labii, even though the pleasant tastes are just as stimulating. So study 1 gave us some confidence that we're looking in the right place. Levator labii EMG is indeed tapping distaste, that supposed precursor of disgust. In study 2, we wanted to extend these findings to forms of disgust that are removed from taste sensation but still related to stimuli in the physical world. This time, subjects looked at photographs. This is where I normally worry about my research, but it looks like you're all doing your lunch. So including disgusting images, as well as sad photographs and also neutral photographs. Our specificity control in this experiment is that these sad and disgusting photographs were selected so as to be just as negative. So they're just as unpleasant to look at. Here are the results, again showing levator labii activity for the neutral, sad, and disgusting images. Once again, we see that even though the sad and disgusting images are just as unpleasant to look at, it's really only the disgusting images that are associated with levator labii activity. As another test of specificity, we also asked our subjects to report on how each photograph made them feel. In particular, how sad did it make them feel and how disgusted did it make them feel. We can then look at the relationship between these self-reports and EMG activation of the levator labii. When we look at the relationship between levator labii activity and how disgusting the subjects said the photographs were, you can see pretty clearly that as people experienced more disgust, they showed more levator labii activity. We think this little bit of a quadratic trend just shows that the levator labii is most responsive to the most intensely disgusting images. By contrast, when we look at the relationship between sadness ratings and levator labii, there's really nothing there. So what these data suggest is that the levator labii is indeed specifically tracking disgust experience, not just negative emotion in general. Studies 1 and 2 suggested that the levator labii muscle really is a good indicator of disgust experience. And in study 3, we wanted to see whether this pattern of levator labii activity extends out of the world of physical disgust and into the moral domain. Study 3 used unfairness as a model for morality. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, our strong concern for fairness is a big part of what makes human morality distinctive. So if disgust is involved in our sense of fairness, then in a way, it's kind of part of what makes us human. To model unfairness in the lab, we use the ultimatum game. In case anyone isn't familiar with the ultimatum game, it's a 2-player economic game. And the task of the players is to split a sum of money that's given to them by the experiment. So we might split $10. Subjects in our experiment first saw a photograph of their partner and a name, and then they saw the offer that their partner made, which could range from a fair offer, which is around 50-50, through to the example here, where the partner is offering to give you $9 or give you $1 and he'll keep $9. This is a very unfair offer. And this is where we did our EMG reporting. The twist of the ultimatum game is that the person receiving the offer can either decide to accept the offer or reject it. If you accept the offer, you get the money as it's proposed. So if I was the player here, I would get $9, I would get $1, and John would get to keep his $9. If you reject the offer, then neither player gets anything. So this sets up a little bit of a tension between my concern for fairness and my concern for getting money. If I was mostly concerned with my economic well-being, I should take the $1 because it's better than getting no dollars. But in fact, people reject offers below about 70-30 most of the time, suggesting that they are motivated to pay a cost in order to punish someone else for their unfair behavior. So in this case, our hypothetical subject has decided to reject the offer. They see an outcome screen showing that neither player has gotten anything. And finally, we asked our subjects to report on how they felt about the offer. Not sure how well you can see that there, but what we've done is given people a series of emotional facial expressions. We looked at disgust, anger, sadness, contempt, happiness, fear, and surprise. And what we're basically asking is, how much do you feel like that guy? How much do you feel like that guy who felt disgust in response to your partner's offer of $1? I want to unpack those self-reports a little bit because they're a technique that's not often used. The idea was that by using facial expressions, we can try and bypass some of those verbal emotion labels that are quite problematic. But how can we be sure that this method actually can distinguish between disgust and anger? To check this, we did a validation study where subjects viewed an array of emotional facial expressions. And we also presented a series of emotion labels like bummed out or pissed off or taste something bad. These are synonyms for anger and for sadness and anger and disgust, but notice that we haven't actually used the words sadness and anger and disgust. So the subject's task is to pick the face that is the best fit for each label. For disgust-related labels like tasting something bad or being grossed out or smelling something bad, people pick the disgust face 85% of the time. And the anger face much less frequently. By contrast, when we gave people anger-related labels like pissed off, irritated, or annoyed, they picked the anger expression 60% of the time, and the disgust expression much less frequently. So these results suggest that this way of doing emotional self-reports by endorsing a facial expression can actually distinguish between disgust and anger. In particular, endorsement of the disgust expression seems to be fairly specific to disgust. So, back to the ultimatum game, what do those self-reports show? Let's look at what people say they feel in response to, so here's what people say they feel, how much you feel like that guy, in response to offers that range from an equal split through to a very unfair split. Of the 7 emotions we looked at, the only ones that varied with offer size were disgust, anger, sadness, and happiness. So not surprisingly, as the offers become unfair, people will get less money, they say they feel less happy about the offer. And interestingly, here's disgust right on top. So that is people saying, I feel like that guy, the guy who smells something bad or tastes something bad. It's also interesting that it's the one that comes out on top, and in fact, it is significantly higher than anger and sadness. So what about those EMG results? Similar to the self-reports, I'm going to show you the love it or lay by activity for offers ranging from fair through to very unfair. What you see is similar to the self-reports of disgust. As the offers become more unfair, you get a path of increasing love it or lay by activity, suggesting that people really do feel increasing disgust in response to increasing unfairness. As a bit of a digression, people always want to know about this little dip for the 70-30 offers. We could speculate if you like, but in fact it's not statistically different from the response to the 50-50 offers, and in fact most people accept both 50-50 offers and 70-30 offers. Finally, we can also look at the relationship between EMG activity and the self-reports, like we did for the disgusting photographs. When we look at the correlation between levator-labii activity and disgust endorsement, so how disgusted the person said they felt in response to the offer, we can see that with more self-endorsed disgust, you see more levator-labii activity. So this is consistent with the idea that levator-labii is indexing the subjective experience of disgust. Remember, people also endorsed more anger as the offers became more unfair. However, there's no relationship between how angry they said they felt and how much you see activation at the levator-labii. So I'm not trying to suggest that disgust is the only thing that you feel in response to unfairness. It's just that it seems to be its own thread, and the levator-labii isn't tracking these other parts of the emotional response. And when you look at the sadness responses as well, you see something else. So taken together, this pattern of results provides converging evidence that the levator-labii really is measuring a disgust response to unfairness that is different from the other emotions that people might feel. So coming back to our list of concerns, the 3 studies I just described were designed to address the worry that moral disgust might be anger or some other emotion in disguise. I presented evidence that the disgust facial expression seems to be specific to disgust, and that we do see it in response to moral transgressions as well as to physical disgust and distaste. So it does not seem to be the case that moral disgust is just anger in disguise. The studies I just presented are also relevant to that first concern as well, that moral disgust might just be a metaphor. It seems unlikely that moral disgust is just a metaphor when people are actually making the same facial expressions in response to unfairness as they are in response to drinking an unpleasant tasting liquid. So, on to the final critique, that even if you do grant that moral disgust is its own thing, it's just not that important in morality. This is an epiphenomenon. It's a minor thing. But what does it mean for something to be important in morality or not so important? One way that disgust might not be so important in morality is if it has a very limited scope. So if it's involved in only a very small part of morality. Along these lines, one of the arguments that's been put forward is that we really only feel disgusted by transgressions that violate norms of purity or divinity. So it's really the gory murders or those perverted sexual crimes that are making us feel disgust. Well, there's a pretty easy response to that. In all of the studies I presented so far, none of the moral stimuli had references to physical disgust. For example, there's nothing intrinsically disgusting about an economic exchange. You don't feel disgusted about splitting a bill at a restaurant unless maybe you think the split is unfair. So it does not seem to be the case that moral disgust is limited to violations of purity norms. So I don't think this limited scope argument holds water. But there's another question we can ask about how important disgust is for morality. Some might argue that the really important thing about morality is moral judgment. So those judgments of right and wrong as something that's distinctive from just good or bad, or punishing or rewarding, or pleasant or aversive. And this issue gets at a much larger debate in moral psychology about whether emotion is a cause or a consequence of moral judgment. One of the major proponents of the cause argument has been Jonathan Haidt. And as evidence that emotion is a cause of judgment, he points to the case of something called moral dumbfounding. That's something that happens when people are unable to rationally explain why they think something is wrong. They just have a feeling that this is not right. Consensual incest is an example that he often gives. If you ask subjects whether consensual incest is right or wrong, they tend to say wrong, even though they're not able to point to a specific harm that takes place. And Jonathan Haidt takes this as evidence that the intense emotions or disgust that are triggered by the thought of incest are enough to actually cause moral judgment. On the flip side, however, I think these data are actually quite ambiguous. So it turns out that people actually make an implicit assumption of harm in response to cases of consensual incest. They think, something bad might happen to these people, or their parents might find out, or something like that. And it's possible that it's this implicit assumption of harm and not the disgust per se that's driving the moral judgment. So I'm not sure that this case of moral dumbfounding is really clear-cut on the issue of whether emotion is a cause or a consequence of judgment. To try and get some leverage on this issue, I'm going to take a bit of a different angle by asking what it actually means for something to be moral. When you think about it, our social world is absolutely full of rules about how we can behave. Is there something different about rules that are moral? One suggestion has been that you can divide up the world of social rules into moral rules on the one hand and social conventions on the other. A classic moral rule is the prohibition on unprovoked harm. So you can't hurt someone just because you feel like it, or you're pissed off, or they're in your way. A classic social convention would be how we talk to each other or how we dress, for example. So you wouldn't show up for a job interview in a t-shirt and shorts. But what's the difference between these two kinds of rules? There are a few, but one of them seems to be that people judge moral rules to be independent of authority, consensus, or explicit laws. So it would still be wrong to hurt someone for no reason, even if we didn't have a law against it. By contrast, social conventions are much closely dependent on authority or explicit rules or laws. So if you're going for your job interview in Silicon Valley, it might be just fine to wear shorts and a t-shirt there. So with that difference in mind, we can now ask whether disgust can actually transform a conventional transgression into a moral rule. So something that is dependent on authority into something that's independent of it. To tackle this question, we took an individual differences approach. I don't know if this is a term that's unique to psychology, but the idea is that we're looking at stable trait-like differences in how people tend to respond to the world. In this case, we're going to ask whether people who tend to experience more physical disgust also judge that conventional transgressions are less dependent on authority. That is, do people who are high in trait physical disgust treat social conventions as if they were moral rules? To measure variation in physical disgust sensitivity, we use a questionnaire called the Disgust scale, which I think has got to be one of the best questionnaires ever designed by anyone interested in individual differences. It has items like, if I see someone vomit, it makes me sick to my stomach. Or possibly the best question ever in a questionnaire, even if I was hungry, I would not drink a bowl of my favorite soup if it had been stirred by a used but thoroughly washed fly swatter. So we administered this measure to a large group of undergraduates, and then we took the top and the bottom quarters of the sample. So now we have a high disgust group and a low disgust group. We then had these subjects do a moral judgment task. In fact, we used the same task that subjects in our fMRI study did. So they were written scenarios, all set in a high school, that described moral transgressions like writing racist graffiti on someone's locker, conventional transgressions like addressing your teacher by their first name, and neutral actions, reading in the library. I'm going to get to the issue of disgust and authority dependence in a minute, but first I want to show you a little bit of a validation check, just to make sure that disgust does actually have something to do with judgments about these kinds of items. To test this, we asked the subjects to make a judgment about how wrong each action was. So let's take a look at the wrongness ratings for the moral, conventional, and neutral scenarios. Looking first at the moral transgressions, you can see that the high disgust subjects in gray are judging that they are more wrong than their low disgust counterparts. So the people who would feel sick to their stomach if they smelled vomit are also judging that writing racist graffiti on someone's locker would be more wrong. Interestingly, we see the same pattern for conventional transgressions. So the high disgust subjects, gray, think that these kinds of transgressions are more wrong than do the low disgust subjects. For the neutral scenarios, rather, there's not much of a difference. So these data suggest that your trait-like tendency to experience physical disgust does actually affect how people. people respond to both moral and conventional transgressions. But there is something to be a little concerned about in the story I just told you. In particular, you might be wondering, how specific are these effects to physical disgust sensitivity? In particular, could it be the case that these disgust sensitivity effects are actually due to a more general tendency to feel negative in the world? So I feel bad about fly swatters, I feel bad about people who are jerks. How do we know this actually has something to do with disgust? To try to address this worry, we collected another measure, a measure of trait anxiety, the multidimensional anxiety questionnaire. And this questionnaire showed that, indeed, the people who are higher in disgust sensitivity also tend to be more anxious. So you would have good reason to worry about whether the data I showed you on the previous slide might be just due to a general negative emotional response. To try and control for the effects of trait anxiety on wrongness judgments, we did a multiple regression where we put both disgust sensitivity and trait anxiety into the model as predictors of wrongness judgments. What we see is that even when we include trait anxiety in the model, disgust sensitivity remains a unique and significant predictor of both wrongness judgments about both the moral transgressions and the social conventions. Actually, it turns out that our measure of trait anxiety is not a significant predictor of either. So these results suggest that it really is differences in trait disgust that are related to differences in wrongness judgments. Now, what about authority dependence? How are we going to get at that? Remember that all of those scenarios were set in a high school. So we can test authority dependence by asking subjects whether it would be okay to do X if the principal, the highest authority figure in the high school, if the principal said it was okay. So for example, would it be okay to write racist graffiti on someone's locker if the principal said it was okay? If they say no, that suggests that they think the transgression is independent of authority. So it's not wrong because the principal says so, it's wrong in its own right. Sorry, that was confusing. It's just wrong, even though the principal says it's okay. That's consistent with it being more like a moral transgression. If they say yes, that would be just fine if the principal said so. That suggests they're thinking of it as being dependent on authority and therefore more like a social convention. So I already gave the example of the racist graffiti. In this case, most people are going to say, yeah, that would still be a bad thing to do, even if there was no school rule against it. By contrast, if we ask whether it would be okay to call your teacher by their first name if the principal said it would be okay, most people would say, yeah, that seems like a reasonable thing. So that's consistent with them thinking of this as being like a social convention. So, how are judgments of authority dependence related to disgust sensitivity? This graph is going to show, it's a long label, but it's the proportion of scenarios that were judged to be authority dependent. Now, I know it's getting a little bit late in the talk, so if you're having trouble keeping all the counterfactuals straight, you can just remember that the bottom of the scale means that they're judging that more items are like moral transgressions, and the top of the scale means that they're judging more items as being like social conventions. For moral transgressions, there's no difference between the high and low disgust sensitivity subjects. And that's not surprising, because they are moral transgressions, so people should say that they are independent of authority. Where it gets really interesting is when we get to the social conventions. The high disgust subjects are actually less likely to say that a conventional transgression is independent or is dependent on authority. That is, they're tending to treat these conventional transgressions as being moral transgressions, as being independent of authority. In short, what the high disgust sensitivity subjects seem to be doing is moralizing those conventional transgressions. Getting back to the contention that moral disgust is just not that important in morality, the data that I've shown you suggests that disgust may actually be involved in moralizing social conventions. It might, that is, it seems to even push back and forth the boundary between these two categories of social rules. I think that makes it pretty hard to argue that disgust is not important in morality. To summarize where we've been, I've shown evidence that moral disgust is not just a metaphor, it's not just anger in disguise, and it actually seems to be quite important in morality. What this suggests to me is that disgust has indeed evolved out of the physical world and into the moral domain, and along the way it's had some pretty profound effects. If you think back to the beginning of this talk, I started out with a double-barreled question. So I asked what emotions are involved in morality and why. Most of my talk has focused on the what emotions part, and demonstrating that disgust is indeed one of the emotions that we feel in response to moral transgressions. What I haven't talked about so much is the why part. What is a food-related emotion doing in morality, of all things? One hypothesis is that moral disgust might provide some kind of withdrawal or avoidance motivation in the social domain. So think about disgusting things. What did I want to do with that rat-infested grocery store? Run away from it and never go back. That's in contrast to the approach motivation that's associated with anger. There's quite a bit of data now showing that we tend to want to approach people who make us angry and try and change their behavior, yell at them, engage with them, beat them up. So by providing for withdrawal motivation in the social domain, disgust might actually provide a really important addition to the repertoire of behaviors we have available to deal with moral wrongness. After all, it's not called costly punishment for nothing, and there's modeling work showing that things like withdrawal or partner selection are actually more efficient responses in those cases. Right now, this idea that moral disgust is associated with avoidance is just a hypothesis, and it needs some studies to test it. Another potential reason why disgust might be involved in morality has to do with the cognitive effects of emotions, by which I mean how emotions affect our thinking. In particular, it could be that feelings of disgust affect our thinking in a way that's useful in the moral domain. But when I started to look at this question, there actually has been very little research looking at how physical disgust affects cognition as compared to other emotions. So we conducted a study to look at how disgust affects episodic memory, which is your memory for experiences and events. We had our subjects look at physically disgusting or fearful or neutral photographs, and after a 45-minute delay, we asked them to tell us what they remember. So which photographs did you see? This graph is going to show essentially how many pictures people remembered for the disgusting, fearful, and neutral categories. And it turns out that disgusting things are actually remembered especially well. So pictures of cockroaches and injuries are actually remembered better than pictures of spiders and snakes and attacking animals. So feeling disgust might function to make things especially memorable. The big question is, of course, whether these effects extend into the social domain. Is it the case that you're especially likely to remember someone who did something wrong, or remember what they did if you feel disgusted by what they did? If so, then this might be another answer to the why moral disgust question. Moral disgust might provide an extra boost to memory that happens to be useful in the social domain. To wrap things up, I started out this talk by suggesting that our moral sense is a big part of what gives human social life its distinctive flavor. The research on disgust that I've presented today suggests that the emotional roots of morality run very deep indeed, tapping into some very ancient motivational systems that are involved in defending the body against poison and disease. That's the implication of disgust for morality, but I think there's also an implication of morality for disgust. So if you believe, as I do, that morality is a big part of what makes us human, and hopefully I've convinced you that disgust is involved with morality, then in a way, disgust is also part of what makes us human. I'll just finish with some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Adam Anderson in the Affect and Cognition Lab at the University of Toronto, Will Cunningham in the Social Cognitive Science Lab at Ohio State, my funding agency, and not least, my participants, who really put up with some awful stuff for me in the name of science. And thank you all for inviting me